Welcome everyone to our quarterly series, What's Happening in Washington. My name is Becky Watts. I'm a vice president at G2G Consulting, and I will be co-moderating our panel today with my colleague, Katie Collins. Katie and I are standing in for G2G's founder, Liz Powell, who usually moderates these panels. So it is our pleasure to take on this role today. We are joined by our guests, Chris Campbell and Chris Oates, to hear their expert analysis on some of the hot topics that are going on in and outside the Beltway of Washington, D.C., and how the country is reacting to them. And we thought we'd start with a round of introductions for any new participants who haven't been to these panels before. And I will pass it over to Katie to introduce yourself first before going to our guests.
Thanks, Becky. It's nice to see everybody today. My name is Katie Collins. I'm a vice president at G2G. I handle our federal portfolio, have a background particularly in health policy, spent 6 years in the Obama-Biden White House, finishing up that time as part of the original version of the cancer moonshot, staying with Team Biden post-administration to set up the Biden Foundation and the Biden Cancer Initiative before moving over and working on legislative affairs and congressional advocacy with the National Institutes of Health before joining G2G. So happy to be here, and I'll turn it over to Chris Campbell. Chris?
Morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you guys are at. It's great to see everyone again. I'm Chris Campbell. I'm the chief policy strategist at a large financial firm called Kroll. It's a global firm. But before that was confirmed as assistant secretary of the U.S. Treasury. And then before that was ran as a staff director for the Senate Finance Committee for a long period of time under Chairman Orrin Hatch. So I've kind of been around DC a long time, seen pretty much every iteration of DC except a 60-vote majority in the Senate for Republicans. Worked and had to put together bills and legislation around that for all those kind of different iterations. And as we're now entering a different iteration that we did last year of DC, this would be an interesting conversation just to see how what is possible this year and how it all looks are we doomed?
We'll hope not. Thanks, Chris. Other Chris?
Hi, I'm Chris Oates. I'm the CEO of a company called Legislative, which is a political information startup, as well as a political risk analyst at Two Lanterns Advisory, which I also created. And I'm, just to keep my time even busier, I also teach political risk at Boston University's Pardee School of Global Studies. My background is on the more analytical and analysis side. So I was a political risk analyst at a company called Oxford Analytica, not Cambridge Analytica. And my first few months on the job saw a debt ceiling showdown and a government shutdown. So it's feeling like I'm back on the first few months of the job. So happy to be talking about what's going on in Washington, where we think it might be going over the next year.
Deja vu.
Yeah, I was going to say deja vu all over again, as they say. Well, thank you, Chris and Chris. And I am Becky Watts again. I am a vice president with Katie at G2G Consulting. I've been here for 15 years, but before that, worked on Capitol Hill as well, worked for a senator from Ohio, who is now governor of Ohio, Mike DeWine, as his appropriations director. And this was during a time when Congress was actively inserting earmarks into the appropriations bills. And so I directed that process for him. And that process stopped for about a decade, and then it has now come back. So it's kind of interesting to see that process, another deja vu situation. But yeah, we're really excited to talk to Chris and Chris about some of the hot topics of the day. We're gonna kick it off with a little bit of the state of the Congress in 2023 and what that means. Are we doomed, as Chris Campbell mentioned? What that means for key issues and policy priorities of the White House and Congress. We'll probably touch a little bit on the 2024 presidential election. We've had a recent announcement this week of Nikki Haley getting in the race on the Republican side. And then we'll look at some current events around national security, Chinese spy balloons, inflation, and let's see what else we have time for, but feel free to, I think you can add questions in the chat through this mechanism. Yeah. Okay. So feel free to do that if people have things they want us to cover. So Katie, I will pass it back to you to talk about Congress.
Sworn in January, so just 2 months ago. And now, of course, my internet's unstable. I'm going to turn this off for just a second, so hopefully you can still hear me. But a new Congress sworn in, a change of majority in the House. We have a small, very small Republican majority. So I thought we'd kick off our conversation with what does this mean for how our government will function during this congressional cycle? We're likely to see differences in priorities with, we're House versus Senate versus White House. So how do we think that will impact government functioning, and what do we expect to see over the next 2 years or so? And I don't know if either Chris wants to start off with that one, or I can.
Happy to jump in. Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. It's a great question. So look, I think, so as staff director for finance, and then as Assistant Secretary of Treasury, I had a leading role in negotiating, I think the last 12 debt ceiling increases. I think it's, it's certainly a significant challenge we face, probably the biggest challenge we face this year, going economically, but also politically. I think it's a real significant threat to business and the overall economy. So for those kind of unfamiliar with DC, it's very important to differentiate a government shutdown, meaning national parks close, and you may get a disruption in your mail service, and the full faith and credit of the United States, or the ability for our nation to be able to borrow money from other individuals in our country or from externally outside of our country, is that ability to stop is quite a significant issue. Again, government shutdowns, maybe a hiccup for a couple of weeks, maybe a couple of months, and it disrupts families. So for vacations or those kinds of issues, very important issues. But the U.S. not being able to borrow money to fund the government operations. Let's just level set this for just a second, is that ever since the 2017 Tax Reform Act, the government has brought in record revenues. So every single year subsequent to 2017, the government has brought in more revenue, more tax revenue to the government every single year since then, and yet still spends about $1.3 for every dollar it brings in. So for us, our government to be able to operate, we have to borrow 30 cents on the dollar that we spend. If we're unable to borrow that money, we can't operate as a government. And so if we default on our loans and suggest that we're just not going to pay our bills, which is what effectively a technical default would happen, if we blow past the debt ceiling timeline, it makes it so that we just effectively makes it much harder for us to raise money or to borrow money from people that are external from the government. That will be a generational challenge. So again, a couple months disruptions on government funding, difficult. A default on the debt, generational challenges. In fact, perhaps even the world may move away from the dollar as right now the dollar is dominant for all currencies, and that would certainly put that perhaps at risk. So that's kind of a level set. And so because of that, as you noted, the razor thin majority for the House. While I negotiated several debt ceilings, probably the biggest of which was the one that led to the super committee, which then led to sequester. We had a certain number of Republicans in the House who would not vote for a debt ceiling increase, no matter what happened, no matter what you did. If you seized government operations, if you passed a balanced budget, whatever you did, that just in theory or in practice would just not vote for a debt limit increase. Probably is numbered about 15, my guess from most recent count. So with a five vote majority in the House, you can do the math. It's a very, very difficult challenge that Kevin McCarthy has. And just also to remember, these numbers always change a lot, but in the Senate, Because this is not not going through reconciliation, it's going to require 60 votes in the Senate. So by definition, what happens in the Senate must be bipartisan. It's going to require 8 votes in the Senate to pass. And so no matter what happens, this has to be a bipartisan solution. It can't be a fully partisan exercise in the House. So, Republicans, Democrats are going to have to come together in a very short period of time in the next 4 months to get something that both parties can agree on and the White House can sign to get done. Luckily, we have enough time to do that. But there is, you blink and it's going to be next month, and it's going to be, this is just a significant challenge we have. This has been by far the hardest debt ceiling we've ever gotten through that at least since I've been around.
And I'll just add to that on the politics of it, because this isn't really a negotiation like a government budget where you have one number, they have another number, maybe you meet in the middle. This is basically a game of chicken, because the consequences of not raising the debt ceiling is, Chris Campbell said, a generational impact. So no one really wants that, but McCarthy and Republicans in the House are assuming that the White House wants it even less than they do. And Biden thinks that McCarthy won't actually go through with it. So it really is a game of chicken. And that's why it's not really negotiations, because the White House has said, we're not going to negotiate. You'll raise the debt ceiling, or you'll be responsible for damaging the U.S. economy forever, possibly forever. And Republicans have said, well, we think that you're going to back down. And then to complicate it even a bit further, and just as a sidebar, most countries in the world do not have a debt ceiling. This is not something that we need for the government to function. It's a relic of World War I, trying to get bond issuances easier through Congress. So there's like no real reason for a debt ceiling. And there's a very good argument that it is itself unconstitutional. Jamelle Bouie of the New York Times has written that it violates the 14th Amendment. But you could also just say, as the president, look, Congress is sending me 2 mutually contradictory things. You're telling me I have to spend money, and then you're telling me I can't borrow to spend that money. As the person in the executive branch tasked with executing the laws, you sent me 2 mutually inconsistent things. I'm going to choose the one that doesn't destroy the economy. So what we have politically is it's not really a negotiation that we can follow in the news. It's a game of chicken. 2 sides think the other side might be bluffing, with possibly a get out of jail free card that the White House can just take by either minting the coin, which you may have heard, or just saying we think it's unconstitutional and we're going to let the courts decide. But meanwhile, we're going to keep borrowing, and Congress, if you don't like it, tough. So that's something that I think is really interesting, just from if you step back from political science point of view. It's not like this is in the Constitution where if this happens, then you do this. This is basically folks in Washington have kind of assumed this is what happens if the debt ceiling is breached, but it's never happened before. We don't really know what's going to happen, and we don't really know what's going to happen in the negotiations. So we're basically making up the norms of federal governance as we're going along. And if the Biden White House just said, we're not negotiating, we're going to assume that it's unconstitutional, it's not like there's a manual somewhere, at least I assume, Chris Campbell, there's not a manual somewhere deep in the bowels of Congress where it says, if this happens, then this happens. It's basically political actors trying to figure out, and their actions create the precedents that later other people will say are the norms.
Yeah, so just jump in real quick. I think we have seen a little bit of preview in this, and that the Congress came right up to the debt limit deadline, I think 5 years ago, and we extended the deadline for 2 weeks to get some things done. In that 2-week period, the U.S. For the first time in its history got a downgrade, so our debt became more expensive. So effectively, the U.S. went from a AAA rating to a non-AAA rating, which means that our debt became more expensive. So we have seen a little bit of preview of what may happen. I think that this is a time when I think it's really important just to lower the temperature, the temperature on this, because if we don't get a resolution to this, our country will change fundamentally. And so I think that there's, I'm a Republican and Chris O's is a Democrat, but it's on this issue specifically, because I've been in the negotiation room so many times on this. It's really important that we really think level-headedly and clearly on this. President Biden has voted against debt ceilings a lot. He negotiated the super committee debt ceiling in 2011, which led to sequester. You have the Obama administration. So I mean, there's no one has clean hands on the debt limit. No one does politically. But there is, this is going to require both Republicans and Democrats get together and find a solution to this. And I'm talking to lots of people on both sides of the aisle on this issue. It's critical that we find a way to get through this. I understand the game of chicken. Both Republican presidents and Democrats and presidents have done it as well. But a breach on this would be significant. And the only thing that's a challenge on this, and politically speaking, I'll just add to Chris Oates on this, is that Congress has yet, in the history of these negotiations, Congress has yet to be blamed on a government shutdown and on the possibility or the diminution of debt limit challenge and the degradation of the U.S. debt. It is always and only the president. It is always and only the president that happens. And so, I don't think President Biden nor does anyone want to be the one to blame for generational challenge of the loss of effectively America. And so that's just the reality we operate in. And I understand that they're going to play hardball in this. And it is always and only in punto. It is always and only the president that gets blamed on these issues.
Interesting. We mentioned Kevin McCarthy, and I thought maybe we should talk a little bit about his speakership and his position with that very slim majority. I'm sure folks have heard that he was elected after a historic, I think it was 15 votes. So do we want to talk a little bit about what that means and for his position as head of the caucus, and how is he managing his party, knowing that majority is so slim and that he had to make quite a few deals to get that secured?
I'll start on this one. I think that what's really interesting here is that it's true that he made a lot of deals to get his position, and so one might think he's beholden to basically the holdouts that voted against him. However, there's a Democratic Senate and a Democratic White House, so it's not as if Kevin McCarthy is going to be introducing legislation that would otherwise be, law versus not. If it were 2017 and there was a Republican trifecta, then yes, absolutely, the negotiating position of the Speaker of the House would be incredibly important. Now it's less so because we know that any policy that actually passes would need to be bipartisan. So presumably the furthest right stretches of the Republican House caucus is going to be relatively unimportant anyway. Now, what I think is going to be interesting, though, is to see whether or not there is bipartisan support in a kind of lowest common denominator, what Kevin McCarthy thinks he can get through, or if, as was suggested by some House Republicans, they'll vote with Democrats on discharge petitions to get things to the floor. So that would, I think, undermine McCarthy's position even more, because if there were, say, 10 Republicans who are looking to 2024, considering whether or not they're going to lose their seats, and think, for example, on the debt ceiling, it doesn't do me any good to, even if the White House gets blamed for most of it, to be associated with what Kevin McCarthy's doing. I'll vote for a clean debt ceiling via a discharge position, which means a strict majority of the House can get things to the floor. Does that change the way it works and that we get kind of a de facto coalition government? I think it's very unlikely for most policy, but it is possible that happens on some extreme cases, in which case his position is undermined from both sides. And so then I think for him, it becomes a question of who's he trying to balance, and does he actually try to balance it, as I think he is right now, by basically conceding in different areas to different people. So he has appointed a number of the Freedom Caucus to oversight positions where they can run investigations, but he also nominated some more moderate members to the Intelligence Committee. And I believe on the first meeting of the Intelligence Committee, he actually went there and said the Intelligence Committee is going to run like the way it's always run. Don't worry about that. So it could be that he is placating his caucus might be the wrong phrase, but doing it in ways that doesn't mean it's always a conflict between one or another, because he's giving a win here to one and a win here to another. But then again, I've never worked in the House or on Capitol Hill, so Chris Campbell might have a better perspective.
Yeah, look, I think it's this new speaker has a handful is a challenge ahead of him. There's no question about it. I could think like it's as these things always do. I'm sure there were lots of quiet conversations had between the then would be speaker and on this path to becoming a speaker. I think it's the reality changes things, of course, and it's and as Chris Oates suggested, there are a lot of interesting and different ways for a bill to become law in the House. They don't always have to go through I don't know, everyone here is a DC geek, but I don't always have to go through what we call regular order. They don't have to go through the Rules Committee. They don't have to go through regular committees that leadership has a lot of significant roles. Plus the body itself, through a process called discharge petitions, has a way of getting things to the floor. So there's lots of different ways of getting around, potentially even the strength and significant power of a speaker in the House. And so, there are lots of ways of doing that. And so I think that, it's also very important to remember, and that there will be a lot of focus in the media will be focused on the House through every one of these processes, right? But through the debt ceiling debate and also the government funding debate, which we got a question on in the chat. But it's again, the joke always worked in the U.S. Senate, but the joke always was you could pass anything to the U.S. House of Representatives because it's just a simple majority vote. And if a speaker says it's important enough, and you're part of the party of the speaker, you do it, right? You kind of just swallow hard and just kind of follow line. That is not the case in the U.S. Senate. It is not the case at all. Where usually requires 60 votes. And again, remember, the Democrats have 52, which require 8 votes for Republicans to get anything done through the U.S. Senate. And so I really believe, candidly, and as being a creature of the U.S. Senate for as long as I have, that the majority of these things are going to be negotiated by Mitch McConnell and his counterpart, Chuck Schumer, and try to find some level of path to get something done. Because again, if you get 60 votes or is above 60 votes in the U.S. Senate, it's going to pass bipartisan to the House, and it's certainly going to be something the president's going to sign. And so I think that it's going to be often overlooked, but it's critically important, the role that Mitch McConnell and Chuck Schumer are going to be playing, and their teams are going to be playing in these very important conversations. There's a real quick question I got in the chat real quick, and asked me if I think the government's going to shut down for months. I really don't think so. I think we're going to see a playbook written in the debt ceiling in August and see how that plays out. However, I will say that I think that where I think that the hardball tactics that are being played right now on both sides of the debt limit will ease back because again, the technical default is really genuinely really significant. I think in October and September, leading into the 2024 election, presidential election, I think the hardball tax are going to be game on. I think it's going to be absolute game on. So do I think we actually do shut government down for a while? I absolutely think so. I think we do. I think it's going to be hard to see a path for not. And I think that both parties would suggest it tees up a really strong debate for 2024 as to how the government operates, what it should be spending money on, what level of government spending should take place, and that kind of thing. So I think that will be a debate, politically speaking, that both sides will want to have. And so I think we will shut down at the end of the year.
Thank you. I want to talk about appropriations and government funding a little bit as we're getting into the FY24 cycle. Chris Oates mentioned we're seeing Freedom Caucus members on Oversight Committee. We're also seeing them placed in the House on the Approps Committee, talking about wanting to lower spending to FY22 levels. So given the balance between the House and the Senate, Chris Campbell.
Katie, we might have lost you. Okay, she's frozen. So I think that the question she was getting to, we're both based in Cleveland, Ohio, and there's like extreme wind going on. So I keep watching my internet too becoming unstable. So I will, I think what she was getting to was sort of what you two, if anything, have any predictions on what advocates who are working with Congress around the fiscal year 24 appropriations process and trying to influence that process, the bills, the language, earmarks, as we mentioned earlier, that types of things, what types of strategies to employ, considering some of these new dynamics with the Freedom Caucus members or anything along those lines. Any insights you can share? Oh, Chris, which, if either of you want to take that one.
Yeah, look, for all my time in the serving in the U.S. Senate, I luckily never worked on appropriations. I always was a direct appropriator, so I worked in finance, so you never had to go through appropriation process. But I think like it's earmarks. I think, personally speaking, I think it's stupidly become like a real flashpoint between the two parties. I think it's, I think wasteful government spending is bad if you call it an earmark or not an earmark, whatever it is, right? But if it's great and it's something that could be, a significant benefit to a district or a state, I think that's, that can be it can be critical as well. So I think, I think that there are different ways of looking at the issue. Just remind people that the House has set as part of their rules that there have to be single issue appropriation bills, which means that every appropriation bill title, there's 13 of them, all must move independently and only have and be subject to that one item and appropriation. So let's say defense, you couldn't put in a road issue or a water issue or something like that, that would be non-defense related. And so that's, I think that it'd be it's always hard to get appropriation bills over the goal line. Getting a single issue appropriation bill is going to be really, really difficult. In fact, I don't remember a time it ever happened. Maybe it has. We'll see how that goes. I think it's going to be challenging, but I think it's certainly something it's native in the House rules now, and I think it's going to be interesting to see how that process works. Again, I would just point out that the House can pass a ham sandwich. That does not have to happen that way in the U.S. Senate, and it will not happen that way in the U.S. Senate. So I think that it's I think it's. I wouldn't look past the appropriators in the Senate for their very important role that they'll play in the appropriation process. However, as I said before, I do believe we will shut down at the end of the year, because I think it's would be in both parties' advantage. They think they both see it politically in their advantage to do so.
Sorry about that, folks. We're having a windstorm here and my internet does not like that. But I'll ask one more question and then we can kind of turn to the current events side of things. Congress and the White House have recently announced that they're going to end the COVID emergency in May. So there'll be some changes in terms of who pays for COVID testing, treatments, some changes in telehealth rules. I'm curious if you see this as a sign that the government is officially done with COVID and we're moving on, or do you see COVID having any continued impact in policy and government, over the next year or so?
Well, I can take this. I think that definitely COVID is done as an emergency and as an issue for Washington, but the lessons learned from COVID are going to probably grow as we get further out, and we learn what are the things that have changed and are sticking around. And I think telehealth is a great example. My wife's a doctor, and so many hospitals and doctors were forced to go telehealth in March and April of 2020. And many of them went back, but some have stuck around. Some have learned how to do that. A number of EMRs started. Startups around that time started because they realized there was an opportunity. And a lot of those things haven't been solidified yet because they were still somewhat temporary and up in the air. And so I think what's going to happen is the government is going to start to realize, and by that, I mean, agencies are going to start to adjust working practices. Funding is going to be starting to be available for things that over the last 2 years have proven to work, but because DC was pretty busy for the last couple of years. It's not like a member of Congress or a senator had time to meet with someone who said, I'm starting for example, a telehealth program to reach rural hospitals with specialists in major metropolitan areas. Those meetings, they take time to happen. Those relationships take time to build. The evidence takes time to grow. So I think what we're going to start to see over the next few years are people basically look back and say, this thing that happened, which we thought might just be a temporary COVID bump, is now permanent. How do we adjust to it? Which is also an opportunity for anyone working on those areas to realize that now people have time to kind of look more long-term about what they want to make permanent.
Yeah, only and very importantly, because we're usually hit a business audience in this, extremely important relative to what Chris said, that we've gotten to a telehealth posture in the U.S. government because of an emergency declaration that the president has issued and has continued. And so I think, it's important to note that, yes, I believe as well as that kind of COVID is going to become the new flu. I predicted a long time ago this was going to happen. I think we're kind of there now, but I think that the challenge is that for many, and very importantly for many businesses, especially in healthcare, a lot of the lax regulations that have been put in place for Medicare, Medicaid, and then telehealth services and reimbursement for those have been critical, and many businesses are now predicated upon that. And those are all subject to elimination should the government end its designation of emergency healthcare health initiative. And so that is, it's a significant issue. As Chris Oates suggested, there will be a lot of lobbying of Congress around making permanent telehealth issues. I think it's critical for those who are in businesses that would be impacted by that, or patients that that use those kind of services, to start weighing in and with Congress and members of Congress, because for those issues, because it's going to take a change in legislation. Because again, if the president removes the healthcare emergency declaration relative to COVID, telehealth goes away. It is prohibited by law. That law was waived by the administration, previous administration, this administration, those telehealth services and the reimbursement for them are really difficult to get if that emergency declaration goes away. So it will require an act of Congress in a very difficult environment in Congress to get to a place where they can agree on this. But it's so again critically important that the way that Congress works, it's a squeaky wheel syndrome, and so the squeaky wheel gets the grease, and it's really important to work with your member of Congress and the senators, the White House, to make it known that that's a critically important issue that would impact much of the U.S. commerce.
Thank you. Really interesting perspectives. We were kind of hoping to switch, I think, from the congressional focus into presidential, and especially with Nikki Haley's announcement this week that she will be running against her former boss, President Trump. And she's currently the lone Republican officially declared to run for president in 2024, aside from Trump. So just kind of curious about, she's early polling as she's in single digits. They're obviously still raising money, but just kind of curious what your take is on her announcement at this particular stage, why she chose to do it now, and what your expectations are moving forward as we kind of ramp up. I know you've talked a lot, Chris, about the potential government shutdown and where that positions folks in terms of the presidential race, but just curious about your take on the Nikki Haley announcement and what that means for the race for 24.
I think it's going to be a crowded field. I think, it's, and I hope it is. I really hope on both sides it's a really crowded field. I think it's, polling is accurate. The short of, the greatest earthquake ever and us all drowning, it looks like many Americans do not want President Biden or President Trump to be president again. So I think it's, that's the one thing no one wants. So I think it's I think it's now an opportunity for us to perhaps look beyond those two and try to find a way to have a robust conversation as to who's going to be who's the next generation, who's going to lead the country moving forward. And so I look forward to some very spirited debate throughout the next 2 years. And it's going to be quite interesting, quite entertaining. I think it's an opportunity. Politics, the way it should be, a marketplace of incredible ideas and incredible people. And I'm really hoping that we return to that as we see approaching this next presidential election.
Yeah, and I think it's very far out. And I think a lot of the folks who say it's Trump's to lose or it's DeSantis's to lose, I think it's premature. At this stage, I remember in the 2006, it was going to be Rudy Giuliani against Hillary Clinton, and that was absolutely locked in. And so a lot of things can happen. I'd say on the Democratic side, it really comes down to whether President Biden chooses to run for re-election. I think that's almost certain at this point. Everything seems to be pointing in that direction. And then whether other Democrats go along with it, because and I think there's the interesting dynamics there, because it's not only do you think you have a chance to win the nomination, but are you going to be hurting your own party by running and having arguments to say, I think that, President Biden's not doing a good job, which if he wins the nomination, which incumbent presidents often do, you could be blamed for having hurt your party's chances. This is what happened to Ted Kennedy in 1980 when he ran against Jimmy Carter. He was blamed in part for Carter's loss to Reagan. And so it's not just that you might not have a chance, but it's that you might basically make yourself persona non grata within your own party. So those dynamics on the Democratic side are there. I think what's interesting is that they're not there on the Republican side. I don't think anyone's saying, Nikki Haley or Ron DeSantis running against President Trump would ruin their chances within the Republican Party forever. So I think that is one it's partially because he's not the incumbent, but I think it does mean that we're almost certainly going to have a big field in the Republican side. What does that mean? Does a non-Trump candidate split the non-Trump vote and then Trump gets it in? Will we see everyone else come back down to earth, because we basically have seen Donald Trump for a number of years? We know who he is. Some of the other candidates are more untested, so they might be riding high when they announce. I think overall it's too early to tell. But what I think is going to be really interesting, especially if we do have a debt ceiling showdown, if we do have a government shutdown, if we are moving away from COVID and inflation, what are going to be the new set of issues, in which candidates are there to jump on those issues and advocate for certain policies? Because although it's too soon to tell, it's very difficult to imagine that what we're talking about today is going to be what is going to be talked about on the presidential debate stage in September and October of 2024. So I think that's going to be really interesting to see.
Yeah, I agree. Really great perspectives. Appreciate that. You mentioned Chris Oates, Ron DeSantis, a name we're hearing a lot in the potential taking on of former President Trump. When do you think he'll announce? Like, what do you think his strategy is going to be moving forward? Trump has coined a nickname for him, but not yet for Nikki Haley. Does that mean he doesn't care about Haley? What do you think about what do you think about DeSantis's timeline and announcement?
I'm not sure. I guess sometime in the spring, although perhaps after the Florida's legislative session is over, because then he could say, I've finished the legislative session, I'm now moving on. I personally think that DeSantis is the leading contender to take the nomination, but it's far from certain. And I think he's probably riding high at the top of a bubble. He probably was riding highest right after the midterms, because I think he's positioned himself very smartly as the avatar for what the Republican Party kind of wants. They want someone who can appeal to their, what we've called traditionally their base, but also can appeal to elites and donors. And I think donors have certainly got behind him in the governor's race. I think he raised the most amount of money for a governor's race ever. But, he is a political candidate like anyone else. He has a past. Trump is already trying to start to drum up rumors about his actions when he was a high school teacher, that he's stiff, that he's not personable. He's someone running for president. They're not normal people. So there's always going to be stuff in people's past, or you get up close and they start to crumble. So that's what I think is going to be interesting to see, is how, I assume he's going to come back down to earth, but is it going to be Barack Obama doesn't actually come that far down, from the highs of expectations during the nomination process? Or is it going to be a Sarah Palin where it's almost an immediate crash and burn while getting onto the national stage? I'd say likely he's going to be in the middle. Probably he's not going to crash and burn because he has been tested. But if I had to put all of my money on one candidate, it would be him. But I would try to get really good odds because I don't think it's a lock.
Chris Campbell, any thoughts on that?
I'm in this weird spot where I know personally almost every Republican is going to run for president. So I live now in Ron's state. I think I think it's, again, I just returned to that. I think there's going to be many great candidates on both. I really hope on both sides, and I really hope for an incredibly great spirited debate where we actually talk about real issues that matter most. I think it's important to note, I think that, as Chris Oates said, there's a lot of things that are going to be the wave's going to crest on a lot of the issues that we talked about and debated in 2020, the 2022 election. 2024, myself and many economists on both sides of the aisle suggest that we're likely going to see a recession this year. Maybe at least stays with us beginning of the part of the year after 2024. Many people aren't suggesting it's going to last throughout 2024. And so I think that, inflation just got ticked up again. And which means the Federal Reserve is going to have to really kind of weigh in significantly, perhaps to tamp that back down. And so, which should and might hasten a recession, which leads to a lot of, job losses, folks, having their car repossessed more, their credit, people having to shift to credit cards more. It's last year, 60% of the U.S. People were living paycheck to paycheck. This year, it's 65%, and savings drawdown has been significant. And so most Americans now have eclipsed their savings that they built up during COVID and are now shifting to credit cards, which are more expensive. So we'll start seeing defaults, people not being able to pay, and higher bankruptcy rates going into 2024. And so all of those things will be really significant and should be a churn for a lot of what's talked about into the 24 election. As well as things that we won't even have any idea what may come between now and then. Every day's an eternity in politics, but certainly the economy is going to be something that's going to be widely talked about. If, again, myself and many Democratic economists are right that we'll see a slowdown starting the back half of this year and into the first quarter of 2024. Again, tragedy for most Americans that will have to go through it, but it's the difference between a relative short-term challenge in the economy versus a runaway inflation where just 60% of our country, almost 70% of our country just can't afford anything. It's a really difficult, impossible set of challenges that the Federal Reserve has to tackle, but they've certainly weighed in quite heavily that they are going to prioritize inflation, and which will bring our economy it will slow down our economy just by nature of what the instruments they do to bring down inflation, and that will have a real impact on the pocketbook issues for many Americans as they look to which candidate to support. Interestingly enough, it'll be during that period of time when both parties will choose the nominee. So the economy may be on the rebound after that, the latter half of 2024. But in the period of time when both Republican and Democratic nominees are being chosen, there could be a period of significant economic dislocation or challenges for most Americans. And so it's really important to kind of note that, and who the parties are going to choose in that time is going to be really critical, but as a significant overlay of what's going to be talked about in that time.
Thank you, Chris. So yeah, I mean, I think you touched a lot on inflation and the economy and how it plays into these presidential elections. What do you think about national security as a hot topic? And I know it's a lot of time between now and then, but I think we've all been reminded of it as of recent days with the Chinese surveillance balloons and unknown objects being shot down by U.S. forces. as of a briefing yesterday, I was reading still haven't determined the purpose of the 3 flying objects that were shot down. Obviously this brings things to everyone's radar in the headlines. What is your take on these particular events and just what it means for national security discussions in the upcoming Congress and presidential debates?
I can touch on this briefly. I think they're in my opinion, they're not a big deal. These balloons or objects. The most recent objects, last I read, they're very likely to be research balloons or weather balloons. But yeah, China's spying on us. This balloon apparently was supposed to be over Guam, but got blown off course. But we're spying on them with satellites. I'm sure they're spying on us with satellites as well. They've got their own satellite constellation, and we're spying on each other just through general intel stuff. So I think what's really interesting here was not the actual balloon, but was the reaction in Washington about it, which is more like the reaction after Sputnik was launched, where it wasn't that the Sputnik, which was just a tiny metal ball, was a big deal. It was almost like that was the time when everyone woke up and realized the Soviet Union was advanced in space. This is, I think, a time when we realize, oh, China is spying on us, and they're now a powerful country in a way that they weren't 10 or 20 or 30 years ago. So I think from a national security perspective, we always have to be concerned with these kind of flare-ups that are very likely disproportionate to the actual issue at hand. But I think we also do have to understand that the trend is that anti-China or competition with China or fear of China is going to be a much larger part of our politics and our national security posture, especially because Russia is currently basically crippling itself economically and militarily. So it's hard to say what will matter from a national security perspective in the presidential election, because that is the area which is probably most impacted by events. But I think the long-term trends is that China is becoming a peer competitor with the United States in the military sphere, and that Russia is very rapidly declining. So that doesn't mean that a terrorist movement won't come out, a new ISIS or Boko Haram or Al-Shabaab, or some terrorist act will happen in the United States. We don't know what will happen, but I think the long-term trend is China rising while Russia is falling.
Yeah, one thing I'd add to that is that it's the one race where it's a foot race, and it's a bipartisan foot race of who's going to win is who hates China more. So there is just both parties hate. It's just there is no political downside of being anti-China as a member of Congress of the U.S. Senate. So I think it'll be a matter of great discussion in 2024. I think that that's what I'd say. Again, I agree with Chris that there's a great number of things are going to happen between now and then. 2024 election, who in the heck knows what's going to be? They're going to be fantastical and horrible and amazing and must-watch TV. I mean, that's guaranteed. It'll be, we're in eternity between now and November 2024.
So another, and perhaps our final sort of issue that has been in the news, sadly, gun violence is, once again happening. And Michigan State, we just had another mass shooting on Monday night. 3 students died, 5 injured. This is the 67th mass shooting this year in the United States. Do you think there's going to be renewed efforts around and discussion around gun control measures? What do you think the reaction is going to be in Washington?
I'll go. Although so I think the short answer is in Washington, no. But what I think is interesting, and also again from a political science and just how our system of government works, disturbing, is that a number of state measures are now being knocked down. So I'm in New York. And New York gun control laws have been struck down by judges according to the recent Supreme Court ruling, which says that gun control laws have to be, I believe it was like the history and tradition of the United States, which is a judicial idea I believe was just made up in that ruling. And what I think is really interesting is that, and this is something I've been thinking about for a while, our system of checks and balances doesn't actually include the judiciary. There is, from at least a theoretical point of view, there is no way that the other branches can check the judiciary if they say a law is unconstitutional. You can pass the law again, but the judiciary could say, no, this is unconstitutional. The executive could say, we disagree with you, but the judiciary would say it's unconstitutional. We're actually talking about that with, there's the abortion pill, one of the drugs from it. There's a judge in Texas, a federal district court judge, who may strike down the FDA's authorization of that. Now, it was authorized 20 years ago. And again, this is the sort of thing that hasn't happened, in part because our system has relied on the fact that judges will try not to go too far. They're going to try to restrain themselves. But from a theoretical point of view, there's nothing to stop a federal judge from saying, this drug's off the market, this drug's off the market, this drug's off the market. And the executive branch, which most of us would say, well, the FDA should regulate laws, or legislatures can pass gun control measures, there's nothing to prevent them. So what I think is really interesting, to get back to the gun control, is whether certain Democratic run states like New York or California will have a law that says, for example, folks who have been convicted of domestic violence can't own a gun. That law will be struck down, and they're going to say, we disagree with it, and we're going to enforce that. And yes, that is nullification, and that strikes at the heart of our system of government. But it is, at a certain point, legislators are going to stand up and say, I can win re-election by running on this. And in the words of I think it was Andrew Jackson, they've made their ruling, now let them enforce it. Will we start to see a disaggregation of the United States according to who's actually following which laws? And that's a much deeper question than this, but it's one that I think at the state level is going to matter as gun control measures get passed, struck down, and then maybe try to be reinforced again. Because I can tell you, for living in New York, there is very little to no downside if the governor were to say, we're going to enforce that anyway. I mean, the governor might get locked up. There's a whole other legal thing, but from a purely political and winning public opinion, that's a winning strategy right now. And I don't know where that goes, because that's not something we've seen since FDR and the New Deal laws in the 1930s.
Yeah, just briefly, quickly on that. Well, I love my friend Chris Oates. There is a check amongst the judiciary. The U.S. Senate can impeach a judge. They confirm them, and they can also be recalled and impeached, which happens almost every Congress. At least one judge gets impeached. And then, secondly, I do not want to live in our country where the executive branch chooses which laws to enforce and not enforce. I think that's a very, 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 very scary and dangerous slippery slope. Imagine, on both sides, I could chill your bones like, again, our country is amazing because we have a rule of law where it doesn't matter what party you live in, where you grew up. The executive branch and the law enforcement should be colorblind and should be absence of race and everything else. To try to find a way to very fairly enforce our laws. If we move to a system where our jurisprudence and our ability to be able to rest upon the laws and the rules of law that we have in our country, we literally have now slipped into literally a banana republic. And so it terrifies me to hear what Chris just suggested. It is a country that I do not want to live in, and I certainly hope that we don't get there.
Well, I'm a risk analyst, so I'm supposed to terrify you.
Well, we appreciate it. And these are it's really fascinating to hear both of your perspectives and with the depth of your knowledge and background, and appreciate your time today. Katie, you came off mute. I don't know if you had any final comments before we close out.
I just love the breadth of perspectives from both of you on this wide range of issues. I think we have a lot of things to look forward to, quote unquote, I suppose, over the next year, and watching how Congress and the White House handle these really important issues, and watch the stage be set for an upcoming presidential election. So I think we've got the questions in the chat have been covered. And just want to thank Chris Campbell and Chris Oates and Becky too, everybody for being here today and having this really insightful conversation. This was a lot of fun. I think Becky and I are going to push Liz out on the next one, and maybe you'll have us both back again. But thanks, Chris Campbell. Thanks, Chris Oates, for being here today, and wishing everybody a great day.
Yeah, and just a plug, I think the next one is May 15th at noon, if I'm not mistaken, according to my calendar. So I look forward to reconnecting then.
Yeah, it's gonna be interesting to see what's changed between February and May. I think we can guarantee we'll have lots of new things to talk about. So thanks, everybody. Have a
Thank you
great one.
both. Thanks everybody
Bye.
for coming. Bye-bye.